speech, and it's not just after 9/11, but after the BP oil spill, after the shootings at Virginia Tech, any number of other interesting circumstances that the phone on Kenneth Feinberg's desk has rung, and people have asked him to use a unique expertise that he's developed over the years as, well, the phrase is special master. That's a term of art. Perhaps we'll explain it later. But the fact of the matter is, he is overseeing victim compensation funds. And the one that we're most familiar with, of course, as we just mentioned, was the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. And it's important to remember, Kenneth Feinberg, that you were instructed by Congress in that respect, in the law that was passed right after 9/11, to employ the principles of tort law in deciding who got what.
That's right. Congress, 11 days after 9/11, passed a law. The law said that if you don't want to sue, if you don't want to go to court against the World Trade Center, the airlines, the security guard companies, Boeing that made the cockpit door, if you don't want to do any of that, go into this special fund completely funded by the taxpayer, public money, tax-free. You don't have to. But if you want to, you will be paid very generously without needing to hire a lawyer and go to court and try and win. And over 33 months, virtually everybody came into the fund. 98% of the eligible claimants came into the fund for deaths or physical injuries, burns, broken bones arising out of the attacks.
And there were any number of fascinating questions presented by this, but among those, how far away from the, if you got your lungs scarred at 42nd Street from the smoke and the terrible fumes from the collapse of the World Trade Center, were you eligible for compensation?
No. Deaths were no problem in terms of proof. World Trade Center, airplanes, Pentagon. Physical injuries. Mr. Feinberg, I live in Jersey City. The World Trade Center plume, the fumes, wafted over the Hudson. I now can't breathe. Pay me. A lady on 96th Street, I was hanging up a painting. I saw from 96th Street, I saw the plane hit the World Trade Center. I fell over and broke my leg. Pay me. We said no. We set up a geographic boundary in Lower Manhattan, West Street, South Ferry, Lower Broadway, Canal Street. If you were injured in that geographic location, we would consider payment. You are eligible. But for physical injuries outside of those parameters, we just figured it would take too long, would open up the fund to millions of claims, and Congress didn't intend that. The statute didn't intend that.
And the statute also made it clear that claims for mental suffering were not to be considered.
Congress made express in the statute, you cannot pay people who claim just mental damage. Now that was harsh. There were people that escaped from the World Trade Center without a scratch. Luck. With bodies jumping out of buildings, falling all around them, and glass and carnage. And they would come and say, Mr. Feinberg, I didn't get a scratch. God was on my side. But I can't get out of bed. Ineligible by law. Nothing I could do about that.
The only way that people could agree to this system was to understand that it was fair. And as I understand it, the only way you can convince them that it was fair was to speak with them.
Yeah, but you could never convince them. Fairness, forget it. If you do a program like Sheila Birnbaum's doing it now. Sheila's got the 9/11, the new 9/11 cases. She's got a tougher job than I had.
These are for the first responders.
These are for the first responders. Sheila's got a limited amount of money. She's trying to juggle. I'm glad she can come to Aspen for a few days. I mean, but nobody that comes to see you with one of these programs, no matter what you do for them, no matter how much money you give them, do not expect them to say it's fair. Life is not fair. They lost loved ones, horribly disfigured injuries. They get money. Money is a pretty poor substitute, and they are bitter, they are angry, they are frustrated. And you don't expect anybody who's a claimant to thank you or to consider it fair. You're right, Neal. The public wants to know, in setting up a program, that the program is principled, that it's fair, that it's objective, that you're not biased, and that everybody's similarly treated the same.
In your book, Who Gets What? Fair Compensation After Tragedy and Financial Upheaval, in radio we don't have to hold it up to the camera like this, but I understand it's de rigueur on television. But in any case...
My supply of my book, virtually inexhaustible. If anybody has trouble finding it, just...
Interesting, you were called over to London after the terrible tragedies of 7/7, the attacks on the transit system there. They wanted to see if they might want to do a similar compensation fund. Interesting experience.
It was very interesting. I got a call from Parliament when they had the transit terrorist attacks, 52 dead. And they invited me over because they were thinking of doing something similar. And I went through the whole program and how we designed it and what the rules were. And they were very, very intrigued and interested until one member of Parliament said, "How much did you pay families of the dead?" And I said, on average, tax-free, $2 million each. I was on the next plane home. The English don't have a litigation system like we do in this country. We had to pay people under the law in 9/11 to attract them out of the litigation system. Why should somebody come into this fund and give up their right to sue if you're going to pay them a minimal amount? Stockbrokers, bond traders, bankers in the World Trade Center, in order to do what Congress wanted, try and get them not to sue, pay them so they'll sign a release. $3, $4, $5 million some of the folks got to sign that release. The English didn't have a system like that, and they sent me packing.
The purpose of this, as you say, was to protect the airlines from essentially going out of business, not so much the amounts of the lawsuits, but the financial uncertainty as these cases drag on in public for years and years and years, Boeing as well, any number of entities. But it was also another phrase that you used in the book that was interesting, vengeful philanthropy.
The only way to really appreciate the sound public policy that underlay the 9/11 fund, there'll never be another 9/11 fund, ever, is to appreciate it not from the perspective of the victim, but from the perspective of the country. I mean, you can't justify a 9/11 fund based on the status of the victims. You should have seen some of my emails. Mr. Feinberg, my husband died in Oklahoma City. Where's my check? Mr. Feinberg, my daughter died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same people. How come I'm not eligible? I don't think the 9/11 fund can be understood and defended based on who died or who was injured. It can be defended, and I defend it all the time. I think it was the right thing to do because the American people wanted to demonstrate to the world and to those nations harboring terrorism, you won't win. You won't win. We'll show you how we protect our own people. We'll show you how generous we are as a community of one. You won't divide us. We will get our revenge. And one way we'll get our revenge is by showing you that when a tragedy like this happens, we come to the rescue of our own people. And that is why I believe the 9/11 fund was the right thing to do. Just don't do it again.
This is an interesting question. We've spoken about this in other fora, and I've gotten some email questions in the process, and this is from a gentleman named Ross Eberly. I'm a professor at Penn State and used to be on the faculty at UT Austin, where I taught a course in the 1966 tower shootings and public memory. I'm wondering about the history of restitution. No victims or their families expected restitution of any kind after the 1966 shootings. Penn State is already planning for restitution liabilities for Jerry Sandusky's victims and their families. What are the key moments in the history of restitution?
The tipping point. The key moment for public restitution is the tipping point when the body politic decides we got to do something. That this unprecedented situation, BP, Agent Orange, 9/11, Virginia Tech, we've got to do something in response to an unprecedented tragedy. And there's always a problem, you see. The professor's right. The minute you set up one of these special programs for special people and nobody else, once that program gets announced, Sheila will tell you, there is a sense of entitlement. I'm entitled. You set up this program for me. Well, forget eligibility and proof and the vagaries of formulas. Pay me what I want. There develops a sense of entitlement once policymakers decide, in effect, you are entitled. BP announced $20 billion. Build it and they will come. I received over 1 million claims from 50 states. I think I got 40 from Colorado. 35 foreign countries. Pay me.
And in those circumstances, you were able in 9/11 and in other cases to meet with the victims individually and explain the process, why some things were different, why some things weren't. But in the BP case, this was not possible. And I know you held a series of town meetings.
BP, there were too many claims to meet with individuals. You have over 1 million claims. There's not enough time in the day. You can't have enough resources. So you're processing claims without giving the claimant, the fisherman, the shrimper, the oyster harvester, the hotelier, you're not giving them an individual opportunity to meet with me. It's tough. The program becomes distant, sort of antiseptic, anonymous. Whereas with 9/11, I met personally with 900 families who lost loved ones. And that ability to engage individual people who lost loved ones and to commiserate with them and to explain what the program's all about and to hold their hand. But it taxes you. It is so emotional and so debilitating that you worry about losing your mind, and you certainly worry about losing your objectivity.
There's one case you describe in the book, a heartrending case of a widow who comes to you and says, my husband's such a perfect husband. He played with the kids all the time. He was, and then, well, then something else happened.
Lady came to see me. I thought she was going to collapse. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. And he left me with our 3 children, 6, 4, and 2. He was Mr. Mom. Every day that he wasn't at the firehouse, he was home, teaching the 6-year-old how to play baseball, teaching the 4-year-old how to read, reading a bedtime story to the 2-year-old. He cooked all our meals. He was the gardener around the house. I don't care about the money. It's all about my 3 children. And the only reason I haven't jumped out a window and end my life, without him, the 3 kids. But nothing you do for me is going to repair the loss. I thought she was going to faint. She leaves. The next day, I get a telephone call from a lawyer in Queens. Mr. Feinberg, did you meet yesterday with the widow with the 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2, Mr. Mom? Yeah. Now look, Mr. Feinberg, you have a tough job. You really do. But I got to tell you, she doesn't know that Mr. Mom has 2 other kids by his girlfriend in Queens, 5 and 3. And I'm calling you to tell you that when you cut your check from the 9/11 fund, there's not 3 surviving children, there's 5 surviving children. And I represent his girlfriend and these 2 kids. But I'm sure you'll do the right thing. Click, hangs up the phone. Do you tell her? Do you tell her about that call? I mean, paternity and everything, that's all a given. I mean, do you tell her, Mrs. Jones, well, you're up at 3 a.m. I didn't tell her. It's 10 years later. She must know by now. I don't know the facts. I'm not a family counselor. I'm trying to get money out the door. I didn't get into it. I didn't. I cut one check to her. She has a memory of her husband. Who am I to prick that bubble? I cut one check to her for her and the 3 kids, and I cut a separate check, unbeknownst to her, to the girlfriend as guardian of the 2 kids. And that was it. But chilling. I mean, these stories, when you held these hearings, you heard these stories every day, 8, 9, 10 a day. Very, very difficult.
That's one aspect of human nature that came into your ken as you went through this process. There's another aspect, though, that I think suffuses your book. It goes back to the original Agent Orange case. You were appointed a special master in that case by Judge Jack Weinstein, federal judge in the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn. And you played a key role in getting the 2 sides to agree. It was an interesting case because there was a lot of emotion on the side of the Vietnam veterans who said that they were horribly disfigured in terrible diseases from Agent Orange and dioxin. On the other hand, the company was able to say, wait a minute, there's no scientific evidence. None of you individually can prove that your injuries were the result of dioxin. You got them to agree, though, to a settlement, unprecedented settlement, $180 million. Sounds like a lot of money, except when you're talking about all of the veterans that served in Vietnam.
Who gets what? You have 180 million and you have 250,000 veterans. So Judge Weinstein, we went around the country and held hearings and met with the individual veterans and said to them, how would you like the money distributed? Who gets what? And instead of Vietnam veterans saying, I don't care how you distribute it, just make sure I get mine. No. Almost to a man, the community of veterans said, there's not that much money for everybody. Give the money, award it to those of our brothers most in need. We want our brothers who served with us in Vietnam. They're the ones who are in the most physical difficulty, disabled, in wheelchairs, can't work, no life. Give them the money. And that was an uplifting example of human nature and how sometimes you hope people will react in an altruistic, communitarian way to recognize how to distribute money. Doesn't happen all that often.
There is that case where you're working through the federal courts. Obviously, the act passed by Congress set up the situation you were dealing with after 9/11. You were then called into another circumstance, this after the shootings at Virginia Tech, when a deranged student opened fire and killed both students and teachers. And millions of dollars, about $6 to $8 million, poured into Virginia Tech voluntarily, and they had to decide what to do with that money. Again, sounds like a lot of money, but, well, there were a lot of people killed, a lot of people injured.
The president of the university, a very wise man, Charles Steger, was the president of Virginia Tech. And I went to see him at his request, and he said, you know, we need your help. I think what we ought to do with this money is probably set up scholarships in the name of all the dead. I said, don't do that. Do not do that. Give each family of the dead the cash. If they want to set up a scholarship, let them. Do not attempt to determine what's best for each family. Well, Ken, the trouble with that is that, you know, some of these families may take the money and to celebrate the memory of their loved one, their student daughter or son, they may go to Disney World with the money. So they go to Disney World. Don't get in the business of trying to determine priorities for emotionally grieving people. It is a loser. You won't be able to do it. Let each family get the same amount of money, not like 9/11, the same amount, and distribute it that. And that's what we did. And only 2 people. See, it wasn't tied to the tort system. You didn't have to sign any release. It was a gift. Only 2 people decided to sue after they received the money because they felt they had been treated appropriately.
Not tied to the tort system. So a flat fee, a flat payment to any of the dead, whether they were students or whether they were faculty earning a salary.
And that was a problem, of course. One man came to see me, Mr. Feinberg. I lost my wife. She was earning $180,000 a year as a professor. Why are you giving me the same as a student on scholarship who never worked a day in her life? Mr. Jones, this is a gift. Take the money, hire a lawyer, and sue for all you want. There's no quid pro quo here. So I'm giving everybody the same because why not give everybody the same? If you think you're entitled to more economic loss for the loss of a wage earner, go file a lawsuit and try and get a pot of gold if you can. That's up to you. But we're going to distribute everything equally. All lives are equal, we decided in Virginia Tech.
But all injuries aren't equal.
Well, all injuries can't be equal because some people were seriously wounded, gunshot wounds to the head, and they're in a hospital for 15 days or 2 weeks or 3 months. And other people jumped out a window and maybe broke an ankle, but that was an outpatient and they went back to their dorm. So physical injuries, we paid on the basis objectively. How long was an individual patient overnight in a hospital stay? The longer you were in the hospital, the more the calculator added up additional dollars.
And these systems, as complicated as they may have seemed at the time for Agent Orange and 9/11 and Virginia Tech, they pale by comparison, it seems to me, to the difficulties you faced with the BP oil spill.
Well, the economic loss, the mathematics, the calculations in BP were very, very tough because of the volume of claims, over 1 million, and because hundreds of thousands of people filed claims with no proof. The underground economy. So somebody comes to me and says, I lost $50,000, I couldn't fish. Pay me. Well, show me that you lost $50,000. Oh, we do things with a handshake here in the Gulf. We shake hands and I go get paid, and I fish and then I get paid. Well, I can't pay you on the basis of a handshake. The integrity of the whole program can't allow that. But give me something. Hundreds of thousands of people gave me nothing, and they didn't get paid, and they were angry. Other people gave me sufficient documentation, but it was astounding. One person gave me documentation that justified a payment of $100,000 from the BP fund. And I said to him, okay, good enough for me. You're going to get a check, and with the check, you're going to get a 1099 from the IRS. So he looks at me, he goes, I waived it. You can't waive a 1099. I haven't got that authority. I got to send you a 1099. You really got to send it to me? Yeah. I withdraw my claim. You're going to get $100,000. What do you, if you're sending me anything from the IRS, I'm walking away. Forget it. This program isn't fair. I don't want it. And he withdrew his claim. So it was tough.
Another problem, though, is in the case of 9/11 and in the case of Virginia Tech, you worked pro bono. But given the complications, the amount of time you're going to be working on the case in BP, you thought you couldn't do that.
Look, it's one thing to do for pro bono if you're doing the 9/11 fund. I mean, it's the President of the United States asked you to help the victims of a foreign attack. Of course you had to do that pro bono. Pluto would be too close a planet to live if I ever got paid for that, right? The pays are in the Treasury Department. You're fixing the pay of Wall Street executives. You want to get paid for doing that? BP, you've got an international oil company that fronts $20 billion. You'll never see this again. You show me the next time, or if ever, a defendant company 3 weeks after a tragedy announces publicly, we're going to put up $20 billion to pay the claims. I thought in that situation, they're paying the freight for the whole program. Not only the awards, but the 3,500 people I hired to process the claims and adjust the claims and cut the check. So I'm getting paid. Well, you know what happened then? Fishermen, shrimpers, lawyers, a lot of people. He's getting paid by BP. How neutral can he be? President Obama asked him to do it, but he's making money, and he must be in the tank for BP. It's a huge problem. So I went and got former Attorney General Michael Mukasey in the Bush administration to write an opinion letter reviewing everything, saying it is very reasonable what he's doing, perfectly appropriate. And then I got Professor Gillers at NYU to write a letter, the nation's foremost legal ethicist, absolutely appropriate. I still carry those letters around. Didn't do much good for a long time. Didn't do much good. The only thing that helped with BP that made it a success finally, you get the money out the door. The rest is just talk. Get the money out so people see. In 18 months, $6.5 billion went out. Billion. Before the first trial was even scheduled. That was when everybody stood up and said, okay, successful.
The interesting part, though, is you had also politicians involved here on both sides of the case, and you had BP, who was saying, much not to the point you're in our pocket, you're paying these people on what?
Right. You've got the politicians defending their constituents. Why not? You know, it's a freebie. You're not doing enough. BP's putting ads in the paper. We'll make you whole. You didn't make the dentist, the chiropractor, and the veterinarian in my district whole. The dentists filed a claim. Why aren't you paying us? We lost our patients. The fishermen, they couldn't fish, so they couldn't afford to come to get their cavities filled.
I meant to tell you, the people did not donate to public radio in the same quantities that they had donated before.
Yeah.
So I figured we should file a claim.
Yeah, but you didn't. You should have filed a claim. You wouldn't have got paid. So that's the problem, you see. And nothing you do is going to convince people other than 88 million out today, 94 million out tomorrow, 111 million out next week, 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion. Then the politicians, gee, Mr. Feinberg got $3.5 billion into Florida in the last 15 months. You know, let's quiet our voices.
But that gets back to the question of really where we started, and that is, well, why some cases and not others? And you do this in your book, and I'm just going to quote a little bit from Who Gets What. There was no 9/11 type fund for the victims of the Oklahoma City terrorist attack, the suicide attack directed against the USS Cole in Yemen, or for those who died in the original 1993 attack at the World Trade Center. Congress fell silent when it came time to consider compensation for the victims of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or the tornadoes that ravaged Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Joplin, Missouri in 2011. What cases are appropriate? What aren't?
Most of the people in this room, I think, probably there's an assumption in your mind these programs are a bad idea. You see, you carve out for special treatment, 9/11, BP, everybody else, you're not eligible. Don't bother. This program in BP, you may have environmental damage from other reasons, not your fault. Don't bother. Just these people. Why? Because your elected representatives, the American people, reach a point where, a tipping point. For this tragedy, no other, we want to do something. We want to do something commensurate with the magnitude of the horror. Oklahoma City, I think, horrible, doesn't rise to the level of 9/11. 9/11 is like the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, and the assassination of President Kennedy. It's special. It's unprecedented. So policymakers decide, for this case and this case only, from the perspective of the American people, let's do something. And if you don't reach that political tipping point, I think the 9/11 fund was absolutely the right thing to do. I think the BP oil spill was the right thing to do, frankly. I endorse it. But I can understand why there are plenty of people in this United States who would say, that's not American. Why them and not them and them? Neal got a call this morning from a motorcycle accident victim. He went to sue and he was satisfied, but I got letters, and Sheila probably gets letters. Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't get it. Last year, my wife saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned a heroine. Where's my check for my wife? Very, very risky business as a matter of public policy. You talk about values and valuation. American values get called into question every time you set up one of these programs. And I'm the one, I defend it. I don't decide whether to do it. I get a call after somebody else decided let's do it. But it is risky business, and it should be very, very sparingly, very rare that these programs get promulgated when the tipping point is reached. Otherwise, you're singling out, you people get a break, you people get a break. All of you people, go hire a lawyer, go to court, take your chances, you're not eligible. It's very, very problematic.
Among the skeptics, Jane Kyle emailed us from Portland during the program this morning. At the risk of seeming heartless, I never understood why Congress took upon itself to compensate the victims of 9/11. Where was the liability? They have set us up for the next time, and the next time a terrorist bomb goes off somewhere in the country. When I'm a victim of a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake, the federal government comes in and offers me a low-interest loan for me to build my life back. That's all they do for me personally. I can understand it if all Americans took it upon themselves to contribute to a fund to benefit the low-end victims of the funds, those without life insurance. But to mandate that a terrorist attack requires all taxpayers to make whole the victims, that's a new twist. If terrorists decided to exploit it, they could bankrupt our country beyond anything we've already done to ourselves.
There it is. That's eloquent. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it. But it's a very eloquent statement of the opposite argument, which is be careful about being well-intentioned and compassionate. Just be careful, because bad things happen to good people every day in this country. And there's not a 9/11 fund or a BP oil spill fund. It's true.
And there are those who question the tort system, that it is, A, designed to help lawyers a lot, B, that it takes too long, and C, that it sets up this idea that we are compensated in dollars. Surely there's something more to making people whole than a check.
I haven't seen it. If you go back to the founding of our republic, money has always been part of the compensation mechanism. There may be countries that barter, or a thank you is sufficient, or we'll work in your field to make you whole for 3 months, something like that. The capitalist system, from Jefferson and Hamilton right up to the present time, compensation is the mechanism and the courts are the vehicle. And when I hear people talk about tort reform and the lawsuits and litigation and lawyers, I have 2 reactions. One, the litigation system in this country, the tort system, works pretty well. not perfect. The parade of horribles, we know what they are, medical malpractice and mass torts, and there are problems, like any system. But I think overall, day in, day out, thousands and thousands of cases in this country are resolved through a tort system that I think works pretty well. Secondly, very important, even if you think the tort system doesn't work that well, you're tilting at windmills. If you think you're going to change the tort system in this country or the way we resolve disputes, that system is so ingrained in the fabric of our country. It's so much a part of our history. You may be able to modify it, around the edges, but it is, I think, a permanent feature of the rule of law in this country, and it's not going to be modified.
There are any number of cases proceeding all the time on asbestos exposure. All of us has probably learned the word mesothelioma from watching late-night ads on television appealing for victims. This would seem one of those cases, you say it's rare, but one of those cases where why don't we all get together, find a compensation fund, and make everybody happy.
You mentioned asbestos. You ought to corner Sheila Birnbaum here, who knows more about asbestos than anybody in the United States. And she will tell you, first, asbestos is a unique problem in this country. The pervasive use that was made of asbestos, it had a social utility in this country. It was a valuable mineral. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives. It's a problem. It's a huge problem. Congress has periodically thought about setting up some sort of BP-type fund for asbestos. The legislation for the last 30 years has foundered. Why? Why? Who's going to pay for it? BP stood up after they saw the president, stood outside the White House and announced, we're going to front $20 billion. We know, maybe we can get money later from Halliburton or Anadarko or Transocean. We're going to front $20 billion. If somebody wants to front $20 billion to fund an asbestos fund, fine. Never happened. Asbestos, they'll litigate. They'll litigate and litigate and litigate before they will front that type of money. So every time you talk about a fund like BP, show me any time if it's ever been done before, and I doubt very much it'll ever be done again, where a company 3 weeks after the explosion says, here's $20 billion, spend it wisely, and frankly, we're not going to announce who's going to spend it. The president wants Ken Feinberg, we're satisfied with Ken Feinberg, let him decide who's going to get the money. Huh. Never heard anything like it before. You'll never hear anything like it again, I don't think.
Yet you also say that this was not the one-sided deal that it might seem.
No, BP knew what it was doing. We don't want lawsuits. We have watched Exxon Valdez. They're still litigating 22 years later in the courtroom. We don't want that. Our share value has dropped 60, 70%. We've got to show the world some certainty in coming up with an alternative to litigation. And frankly, we have federal drilling permits pending to drill in the Gulf of Mexico. Now's not the time to be defending lawsuits. Oh, no. It was far from one-sided. BP knew what it was doing.
In a few minutes, we're going to take any questions that you might have and put them to Ken Feinberg. So think of something really devilish, and we'll take it. But I wanted to ask you another point. You not only went to London to talk to people about possible compensation fund for the victims of 7/7, the transit attacks. You also went to Australia, where the issue was compensation for the terrible wrongs committed against the Aboriginal peoples there.
Again, I received an invitation from the Australian government to go to Canberra and testify they were considering a compensation program for those Aboriginal generations whose forefathers had the children taken from them and put into white orphanages in Australia against their will. A horrible blot on Australian history. So I went down, they treated me very well, and we held a hearing, and they asked how you set up a fund, and you know, it shouldn't be all that difficult to define those families, Aboriginal families who lost children who were seized and removed from the household. And then we got around to the amount. And again, they said, how much did you pay in 9/11? Death claim, $2 million. Physical injury claim, $400,000. I think they canceled the hearing the next day. The amounts that you talk about in the United States are invariably tied some way to the alternative, which is litigation. And the litigation system in the United States is so unique. It is so rare. It is so unlike anywhere else in the world that you need these type of dollars in these programs to secure an alternative to suing. Well, in Australia and London, you don't have those problems, and the dollars chill government officials from even going down that path.
I wonder, have you ever been approached by those who seek reparations for slavery?
No, I've never been approached. Now remember, 9/11 was not reparations. The United States government never paid a penny in 9/11 by claiming it was responsible for the attacks. To this day, there's never been an apology from the United States for 9/11. Reparations are paid as an apology. Here is money because we as a government did wrong. German government payments to Holocaust victims, reparations. President Reagan's decision to sign a law and pay the families of those Japanese American citizens interned after Pearl Harbor and removed to New Mexico and Arizona. 30 years later, 35 years later, a law was passed, $20,000 to each Japanese American citizen family, and an apology from President Reagan, we did you wrong. Reparations are as rare as these programs that I design. You don't get governments very often apologizing. With slavery, it is so diffuse, it is so pervasive. Everybody was involved. It was part of the culture of 19th, 18th century America. The idea that today in 2013 or 2012, you're going to set up a reparations program to pay for an admitted wrong, I think there's not a chance that that will happen today.
And you write, after each of these cases that you describe in your book, that you thought this was going to be the last one. Yet today, the state of North Carolina was just voting on reparations for victims of the eugenics program some 50 years ago. You're talking about, as one of our emailers mentioned, a fund to compensate the victims at Penn State.
Now remember, Penn State, I don't know what Penn State might do, I read about it, but don't forget, Penn State's like Virginia Tech. That's a private program. Now, it's a public university, but I don't think they're talking about public money. BP was private money, but it had the blessing, you see, of the administration. President Obama and the Department of Justice setting up the program using BP's money, so it's a hybrid. 9/11, unique. 9/11 is totally 100% taxpayer funded. That's why this woman, very eloquently in that email, says, wait a minute. It's one thing if a private entity wants to set up a fund and avoid lawsuits, and it's up to them, I guess. The idea that the taxpayers will be asked to foot the bill. I think 9/11 was the right thing to do, and I don't think you'll see it again. And I think if Congress had thought about it 2 more weeks, I doubt they would have done the 9/11 fund that way, but I'm glad they did.
And there is then the thorny question. You mentioned your role earlier as the pay czar. Well, we're hoping financial meltdowns are unique. We're hoping they don't arise again. We're hoping companies are no longer too big to fail. We'll see. But nevertheless, you were thrust into an unusual circumstance.
Unusual? Unprecedented. Congress passed a law after the tort bailout using taxpayer money. Populist revenge. We bailed you out and kept you afloat. AIG, Citigroup, Bank of America. We're going to fix your pay. Now, we don't know how much it ought to be, so we'll ask the Secretary of the Treasury. Well, the Secretary of the Treasury, he doesn't want to do it. Ken, why don't you do that too? and under the statute, I had to determine the pay for 175 corporate officials. That's all. But not principles of how they ought to get paid. Exactly what are you going to pay them? How much? So we met with them. Everybody was indispensable. Everybody I met with, if we lose this guy, he's indispensable, we're going to go belly up and the taxpayer will never see the payment back. Indispensable? First you say, the graveyards are filled with indispensable people, right? And then they say, if you don't pay us enough, we're going to leave the company and we're going to go to a competitor. And we're not going to just go across the street. We're all going to go to China. Everybody's going to China to work if they don't get what they want. So you had to figure out who gets what. That was far different from the tort system and damages, but it was challenging because everybody counts other people's money. Everybody counts other people's money. You're paying me $1 million, you're paying that corporate executive there $2 million. You're paying my next door neighbor $2.1 million. Why are you only giving me $1 million? What do you got against me? What did I ever do to annoy you? Everybody, absolute dollars are only half, maybe a third of the problem. Counting other people's money, that's where it gets really difficult.
And there were also conflicting interests. You had the populist sentiment, as you mentioned, and there is, on the other hand, the fact that the United States government now owns these corporations, or very large parts of them, and the Secretary of the Treasury says, whatever you do, Ken Feinberg, do not drive these companies into ruin.
That's right. We got to get our money back. Ken, just be careful. Cut their pay, but don't let them leave. Make sure that they can pay us back with interest. That top program, by the way, I think in looking back in history, historical terms, absolutely a 10-strike what was done. The economy would have been in ruin, and most of those companies that have taken the top money, not all of them yet, most have repaid every dime with interest to the U.S. Treasury.
One hasn't, AIG.
AIG, your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren may see the money.